Hail travelers, and welcome to the Knight's Realm. Here in the realm of Camelot, I, the Guardian Knight, venture deep into the archives of popular culture and entertainment to bring you all my own perspective on such matters. Today, however, I am venturing into something of my own creation, or at least my own recreation. Over the course of my Bayverse Rewritten series, there were many ideas that did not see the light of day, from plot points to character moments to deaths and even survivals. So I thought I'd share with you all what could have been, and as a bonus, where I imagine this particular universe would go after the events of Wrath of Unicron, showing the fates of Rodimus Prime and the reunited Cybertron, as well as certain loose ends I was unable to tie up in the main story. Now, join me as we delve deep beneath the castle and begin our quest. The first movie was the one I changed the least, and as such, it's the one I have the least amount of things to talk about here. I had at one point thought about making either Lennox or Michaela the main characters, abandoning the Witwicky storyline entirely. But in both cases, the movie ended up being far too different from the original, to the point where I may as well have written my own story. I considered making the Autobot cast bigger, introducing key characters like Prowl and RC, who was originally meant to be in the actual movie at one point, into this first entry, but ultimately settled on the 5 we got in the original film. I toyed with how to kill Megatron for a bit before deciding that it would be better if he survived the first film. I had originally intended on keeping Jazz's death at first, just making it more heroic and less hand-waved, but I realized I wanted to do more with Jazz. We'll touch on him more a bit later. Beyond that, though, the first movie script ended up being not too dissimilar between the original idea I had and what I ultimately put out. In the end, all I really wanted to do was get the bots there earlier, characterize the cons more, and trim out the unnecessary human plot points and bad humor. The jokes and plot points I liked were kept intact. Probably the biggest change I made was in how it opened. Rather than this mysterious alien invasion that slowly builds to the Transformers revealing themselves, I very much wanted it to be a Transformers movie from the get-go. Hence the opening scene at Tiger Pax and the Nemesis scene after Blackout's attack on Qatar. Some have criticized this decision, as well as my decision to not make the cons look like unknowable, Cthulhu-like alien monsters, but I stand by both choices. If you want a movie about humans fighting grotesque aliens, there are a million other movies for it. Transformers should never have been one of them. The bots and cons have always been equally characterized across their incarnations. There have been whole episodes of Transformers shows and issues of comic lines dedicated to the Decepticons exclusively, where no Autobots make an appearance, and they're often among the most heavily praised additions to the franchise. Thirst was one of the few episodes of Beast Hunters I'd rank alongside the first 2 seasons of Prime, for example. Basically, I took the existing plot and tweaked it to give the film that Transformers feel, like I mentioned in my Bumblebee review. But that's all I have to say on the first film. The writing process for my Revenge of the Fallen rewrite was interesting, to say the least. It is no secret that the actual film didn't even have a finished script due to being made during a writer's strike. Just an outline and a few lines of dialogue written by Michael Bay and a few others. Hence the meandering pace of the second act. Everything from the end of the forest battle, the only good scene in the movie, and the beginning of the battle in the desert was so dragged out. On top of that, when it came to my rewrite, I didn't want Sam to be the main character as he was in the original film, but most of the Autobots sat out the movie until the finale, except Bumblebee and the twins. B would have been difficult for me to make the main character due to his lack of voice, not impossible but difficult, and I hated Skids and Mudflap with a burning passion, hence why I replaced them with Sideswipe and Sunstreaker, but kept Skids around as an answer to the enigma that is Jolt. With Optimus dying in the beginning, I seriously struggled on the protagonist front. At first I thought about pulling a Thrill of the Hunt / Wrath of Unicron a few movies early, and just making an entirely new story, as introducing the Fallen this early and killing off Optimus for the entire second movie was daunting. However, I was not yet confident in my ability to write more original stories in this universe, and still wanted to be as close to the original film as possible, even though that was far more difficult for this one. Ultimately, I settled on Starscream as the protagonist, as his actions were what drove the plot. But I had tossed around the idea of Jazz, Ironhide, or Jetfire for a bit, and even thought about not killing Optimus at all. But sparing Optimus made Megatron's threats feel toothless, something I always hate when it comes to villains, so I kept that in. The Matrix was another thing I struggled with, as I hated it being buried on Earth rather than being carried in Optimus's chest. I also hated how it looked, but that's a completely separate grievance. The Fallen was another aspect I toyed with. I knew I didn't want him to be Megatron's master, as Megatron is commanded by no one. But I did play with him challenging Megatron for leader of the Decepticons. But that made the Prime's imprisonment of him seem flimsy if he just freed himself after Optimus died. I wanted the Allspark to awaken him, Optimus's death to weaken his prison, and Starscream to organize his freedom, which is what ultimately happened. At one point, I thought about Starscream going to Egypt alone and returning with the Fallen, or even just going to the Pyramid alone, but Megatron was already kind of suspicious of Starscream, and he's never been one to sit on his hands. The Fallen's defeat was a doozy, as I found his death in the actual film to be pathetic, and didn't want to kill off such an important character to the mythos in his first appearance. I had planned to do more with him in the later films, but, well, that didn't happen. More on that later. Bumblebee getting his voice back was a last-minute addition, added because I didn't want to do the stuttery radio voice for a whole other movie. Plus, in my opinion, making Bee mute is one of the biggest faux pas of the films, and its ripple effects there for a bit were annoying. Even in Prime, my favorite show, it was never my favorite aspect of the story, though at least they did tell a compelling arc with Bee, Ratchet, and Megatron in that case. People for a while there thought Bee was the mute one, when that had never been an aspect of his character before. It's up there with people genuinely thinking Optimus had violent tendencies because of the movies. This is one that, if I could go back, I'd probably have written a whole new story that led into Dark of the Moon better, and saved the Fallen plotline for something else. But, that being said, the end result isn't half bad. Not my favorite rewrite, and definitely not my favorite to work on, but far from my worst work. The next, however, I consider to be my best work. Like old Mikey Bay before me, I had originally intended to end the story at Dark of the Moon. Many of the deaths in this one are a testament to that original intent. One death I almost didn't do, and honestly probably the only one I regret doing, was Jazz. If I could turn back time or do this project all over again, I would not have killed off Jazz. I'd have had him survive the entire series, in fact. His death was another last-minute addition where I really wanted to show how much the cons weren't messing around. But considering the deaths that did happen up until that point, this one feels a tad unnecessary in hindsight. Ironhide almost survived as well, but then I realized how impactful his death could have been to Optimus's character, and pushing him to go as far as he does, something that the original movie really should have played into. It wasn't until I knew I wanted to continue the story in some form that I decided to spare Shockwave. Bludgeon features in this film in flashbacks, but he almost showed up in the present as well. Starscream was going to approach him for aid in a coup, but Bludgeon would drop hints that he has loftier goals. He was ultimately cut because he ate up time that I wanted to use to develop Sentinel. There were going to be more flashbacks, one of which ultimately made it into Wrath of Unicron. Like the Bludgeon point, however, they ended up eating into the runtime a little too much. Prowl nearly made it into this movie too, as did Hot Rod, both of whom do appear in the next one. Jetfire almost didn't survive, as I had originally planned on him taking out Starscream and then getting shot down. By that point, though, I didn't want to kill another Autobot. RC survived for much the same reasons. Thundercracker and Brawl were originally toast, but I realized I wanted Bruticus in later stories and wanted to pay some lip service to IDW Thundercracker's eventual retirement from Decepticonism. A plot point in those comics I actually quite like. Even so, both of their fates were kept intentionally ambiguous in the film. Chromia might have survived as well, but her fate was more of a coin toss in comparison to Jazz's. And unlike Jazz, I don't regret this one, though it could have been interesting seeing her in later installments. Mirage originally had a much different arc. He was going to be a full-on Sentinel true believer and only begin to doubt after the invasion. The reason this changed is because Sentinel's actions at the Autobot base were so violent that the pacifistic Mirage would not have followed him without it feeling incredibly out of character. So ultimately I had him have his crisis of faith earlier and end up actually being the one to save the day, destroying the control pillar. Wheeljack nearly died as well, but I decided at the last minute that his fall wasn't fatal, and I'm glad I did. At the beginning of this project, I had thought about, as Phoenix Studios had done before me, ending this movie with the original ending. However, what I had done with Megatron and Revenge of the Fallen would have made that unsatisfying as good of an ending as the original planned ending for Dark of the Moon was. Hence, the final duel between him and Optimus. The human collaborator sat in a weird place for me, and I nearly cut them, but I did like the majority of that plot point in the original movie, so I kept it. just altered. Nest nearly played a much larger role in both this and the previous film, but with everything going on, I struggled to include them. They were also a source of frustration in Wrath of Unicron. Mindwipe, who would eventually feature in Thrill of the Hunt, was also going to make his debut in this one and play a pretty big role in the subjugation of humanity. Ultimately, though, I decided Soundwave's hacking into the planetary defense grids was good enough. So, there's Dark of the Moon. Already a spectacle, it was almost both bigger and darker. Where I split Age of Extinction was almost completely different from what it ended up being. Lockdown was originally going to be working with Cemetery Wind, like in the actual film, but they would have been his sole clients. The Dinobots would then have featured in the next movie, which would have had a civil war between Bludgeon, Starscream, and Shockwave for control of the Decepticons, while the Quintessons schemed in the background. Nemesis Prime, however, would have ultimately been the main antagonist, killing Lockdown and seizing control of the KSI bots from, well, KSI. Nemesis in this early draft would have become a herald of Unicron alongside Galvatron, Cyclonus, Bludgeon, and Scourge. The Autobot cast nearly had both Hound and Bulkhead, Hound replacing Crosshairs, but I decided I wanted Prowl. Hound would feature in the next two films, though. Like in Dark of the Moon, Jetfire and RC almost didn't survive this movie, but I decided I didn't want either of them dying off screen. Even after the revised version of this story, where I moved Lockdown to the next movie, Nemesis was still originally going to be a much darker character. He was slated to join Unicron at first, then I thought about him starting his own faction of Decepticons, which would take Shockwave's place in the Civil War storyline. Then I considered him awakening the Fallen and serving him. Pretty much any of these could still have happened, until I really started diving into the character and just questioning how a being like him would truly react to things, and whether or not his nature was truly evil or just confused. I had at one point wanted him to be the literal manifestation of everything Optimus held in just below the surface, the living embodiment of Prime's dark side. I still really like that idea for Nemesis Prime, but as I tried to make it work with this version of the character, it just didn't fit. Starscream nearly played a larger role in the movie, but I couldn't find a way to fit him in. Shockwave was going to be killed by Nemesis at one point, both when Nemesis was more evil and after I had started him down his actual arc. But I decided that the Dinobots needed a win. I nearly kept Ratchet alive, but like Ironhide before him, Ratchet's death motivated Optimus to act. Attinger's fate was nearly akin to his death in the actual movie, but I would have had Optimus actually grapple with the decision to kill a human rather than have it offhandedly. The concept of a dark Matrix was something I had thought about, a mirrored clone of the Matrix made when Nemesis was forged. The problem was that I couldn't come up with a good explanation as to how KSI or even Shockwave could make something like that. If Nemesis had been literally forged from Optimus rather than from Sentinel, this could have worked. But as it is, he's more Optimus in the spark and mind than he is in the body, though he does look like Optimus in body. I almost pulled a Mechagodzilla in Godzilla vs. Kong, and am glad I didn't, by having Nemesis be Sentinel reborn. I toyed with this thought very briefly before deciding it was dumb and to make Nemesis his own character. Megatron would have appeared in this movie at one point, rebuilt in secret by KSI, even more secret than the other bots, in a body more reminiscent of his Armada counterpart. He would be activated at the very end of the movie in response to the destruction of the other KSI bots, before killing the humans and seeking out the other Decepticons. It would be in this body that he would eventually become Galvatron. This idea never left the idea stage, however, as I couldn't figure out how Megatron would have ended up in this new shell after his original one was taken off-world by Soundwave. A lot of these in Age of Extinction died in the idea stage, honestly. The final battle was going to be a bit more like the original, but I remembered I had introduced the idea of the Autobots in hiding and didn't want to leave that thread dangling, hence the cavalry arriving in the end. Another idea that never really exited the idea stage was the thought of the KSI bots being forged from the cyber matter in the Fallen's tomb, but that would have opened up a whole can of worms that I was not prepared to deal with. Like, how would the humans get in, what would they have done with the Fallen, etc. Energon nearly played a bigger role in this movie, replacing Transformium as the MacGuffin, with Cemetery Wind powering their vehicles and weapons with Energon and planning on harvesting it worldwide and replacing oil, fossil fuels, and other energy sources with it. This plot point was dropped when I decided on Shockwave as the secret main antagonist. For a sec there, KSI and Cemetery Wind were almost the sole villains after I axed Lockdown, or at least sole villains for the first half of the movie. They would be the antagonists until Nemesis Prime woke up and killed them in the final act, as I had planned on Shockwave taking part in that aforementioned Civil War story in the sequel. The film nearly ended with Optimus confronting the UN, but that felt a tad too political. Shockwave did almost escape this movie alive again, with him being ambushed and captured by Lockdown in a post-credit scene, which is where Starscream would have been as well, either as a prisoner or as Lockdown's client. However, the idea of Lockdown being able to take on Shockwave was an idea that made me go, huh? And with that, we end the movies that were at least semi-based on the actual films. Thrill of the Hunt was nearly a lot of things. First was that Civil War story that I had mentioned, with Lockdown serving either as Starscream or Bludgeon's crony once he was removed from Age of Extinction and added here. He was chanced to be working with the Quintessons pretty early on, though, capturing the leaders of the different factions and taking them to Quintessa. Optimus would eventually kill him, though he, Shockwave, Starscream, Bludgeon, and at one point Nemesis Prime, prior to my having finished Age of Extinction, would all be taken to Quintessa and feature in the sequel, 5 Faces of Darkness. All 3, 4, or 5 of them, at different stages of the writing process, would fight in a gladiatorial arena for the Quintessons' enjoyment, while the Autobots worked to get Optimus back. The Quintessons were very nearly the main villains of this post-Dark of the Moon trilogy, with the Unicron duology being mostly disconnected. 5 Faces of Darkness would have basically been the Quintessa scenes of Thrill of the Hunt, but extended. After the capture the leader's plot was dropped, Starscream took the role he ultimately had in the film. Bludgeon's role was initially bigger, but I couldn't find a way to make it fit. 5 Faces ended up being scrapped entirely, and the bulk of its plot would be moved to this movie. Something that I would have changed in hindsight. Honestly, much like the Jazz point from earlier, I would have removed the Quintessons entirely if I could turn back time. Thrill of the Hunt was a mess, and this whole new faction made it even worse. I wanted to include as much Transformers lore as I could, especially since the films either abandoned it or barely touched on it, and when they did touch on it, it was rarely good. But I honestly should have focused this film on the Decepticons and setting up Unicron. If anything, I think once I got Thrill of the Hunt solidified, it could have used more scrapped ideas. Once I finished Age of Extinction, the Civil War plot was basically gonzo, but as I think on it, maybe that would have been better. Especially considering how big a role the Decepticon factions played in Wrath of Unicron. If this movie had been about Starscream and Bludgeon vying for power, with Lockdown serving one of the sides or even working with Sideways, this movie might have been better. I'm still pretty hard on myself about Thrill of the Hunt. It really wasn't my best work. I had the Starscream plot, the Hot Rod leadership plot, the Lockdown Prowl plot, the Quintesson plot, the Slave Revolt plot, the Decepticon factions plot, and the incoming threat of Unicron when I honestly could have cut some of these. Stopping my self-criticism, Bumblebee was almost revived as Goldblug. Yes, I nearly brought him back again. Unlike Jazz, I don't regret Bee's death, but it could have been interesting had he been there with Unicron, especially since Team Bumblebee was kinda just there. I focused too much on getting this particular part of the series out fast, and I didn't focus enough on it being good. There's a reason Wrath of Unicron took as long to finish as it did. I had learned my lesson by that point. Speaking of Wrath, there isn't much in this movie, or movies, that changed over time, honestly. I knew I wanted Starscream to unite the factions, I knew I wanted Galvatron to take control, I knew I wanted the bots and cons to clash before Unicron revealed himself, I knew I wanted the final fight to take place in Cybertron's orbit, I knew Galvatron would see the light and team up with Optimus to defeat Unicron, I knew that it would end with Cybertron being renewed and the war being over. However, there were some things I didn't know. The Fallen very, very nearly woke up in this movie. I wrote scenarios of him working for Unicron and helping the other Cybertronians defeat Unicron. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a scenario where he would do either. I hadn't written this version of the Fallen as a herald, but as a conqueror in his own right. He also lacks the honor and love for Cybertron that Megatron and others have, as he'd much rather leave Cybertron to burn and remake it in his own image. So I kept him sealed away. Optimus nearly survived. there were two scenarios for this one. One where he defied prophecy and continued training Hot Rod for his eventual rise to primehood. I scrapped this idea very early on. A slight variation of that one where Galvatron forced Optimus to leave Unicron and killed the Chaosbringer himself with the Starsaber, and the version that was very nearly canon, where Hot Rod realized that he was the one in the prophecy and took the Matrix from Optimus before sacrificing himself to destroy Unicron. A subversion of prophecy, if you will, that would allow Optimus to live on and lead Cybertron in peace, with Rodimus sacrificing himself. But I wanted the ending to be a new beginning, so both Optimus and Megatron needed to sacrifice themselves. I was very, very close to doing this one, though. I nearly had Unicron's sick zombie versions of every fallen Autobot and Decepticon in the series on the United Force, but I scrapped that because Zombie Mirage made me sad enough, and on top of that, I couldn't figure out how he would get his hands on all of the deceased. I almost pulled a Predacons Rising and had Optimus survive killing Unicron, but sacrificing himself to restore Cybertron. This got scrapped for logistical reasons, like Optimus surviving the explosion. The Matrix is literal magic, so that didn't bother me, but Optimus? Tougher pill to swallow. Magnus almost died. I had planned on all bots and cons in a leadership position dying, so there was no conflict of succession when Rodimus rose, but Magnus as Rodimus' advisor is such an iconic relationship, I couldn't scrap it entirely. Goldbug nearly appeared in this movie. How, I never worked out, but I did consider him rising and help stop Unicron. The slaves from Quintessa almost appeared, but I couldn't find a way to fit them in. The vision Rodimus has at the end of the Autobots in the Afterlife was nearly a longer sequence where I'd show off everyone's voice just one more time. And finally, Rodimus nearly gave both the opening and closing monologues. I decided against that, as I wanted Optimus to be the one to send this series off. So that's all for what could have been. But what about what may have come to pass? The ideas I had for the future are not solidified, but they'd mostly wrap up plot threads that I couldn't in the main story, as well as exploring stories that the movies themselves didn't lend themselves to exploring. My thought is that these would be basically comic book continuations. First, we'd have a story about the Fallen returning and facing Rodimus Prime. This would test Rodimus' confidence as a Prime, with the Fallen continuing to insist that he's unworthy. This one would be ongoing, the Fallen being attended by Decepticons who didn't want to join the Autobots, as well as Heralds of Unicron who survived their master's defeat, or who weren't on Cybertron when it went down. The Fallen would be Rodimus' Megatron, essentially, attempting to tear down everything he's tried to rebuild. Characters who didn't appear, or who barely appeared, would be given starring roles, like Scavenger, the Aerial Bots, Wreckers, Trypticon, Omega Supreme, and others. Joining the Aerial Bots would be Alpha Bravo, who would end up taking Slingshot's place on Superion. At one point, Starscream would return as a ghost and attempt to regain a body. He would end up in servitude to the Fallen in exchange for being restored. He would meet Thundercracker, who would embrace pacifism and attempt to sway him. This would not work. Eventually, Starscream would lose this new body and be forced to remain as a ghost, though he would possess different characters occasionally. Aside from the ongoing Rodimus vs. Fallen comics, we'd also have Nest comics with Autobots who chose to remain on Earth to keep up relations with the humans. On top of that, we'd have a Beast Wars ongoing series following the Maximals and Predacons who had settled on Jungle Planet long ago. These three series would occasionally cross over. The slaves from Quintessa would become the Junkions after settling on Junk, an idea that I wish I had had when writing Thrill of the Hunt, honestly. And they'd feature occasionally. Velocitron and Giganteon would also feature in small ways. If this comic series got popular enough, I might even have a special Shattered Glass run, with the events of the first movie in a dark mirror, and potentially eventually in the main comics introduce the Minicons as a faction. But I haven't thought too much about those aspects. So that's where I'd imagine the story would go following Unicron's destruction. And there's all the scrapped ideas I had that I can remember, or that I wrote down. I'm sure I forgot some here or there, like ideas that never got beyond a, what if? It's honestly interesting going back and seeing what might have been, and even seeing what should have been in some cases. I like to be as critical or as honest about my own work as I am about others, because If I can't be critical of my own work, what right do I have to criticize other people's work? If this video gets good enough reception, I might do one like it for my future rewrite series as well, but time will tell on that one. Thank you all for joining me on my quest. If you enjoyed the video and like what I do here, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. If you'd like to support the channel further, consider joining the Knights Realm Patreon or becoming a member here on YouTube for $1 or $1.99 a month, respectively, and get access to exclusive content, including videos not available on the main channel and supercuts of my rewrites. More of that will be coming soon. Alternatively, if you'd like to vote on future series or video topics, you can join at $5 or $5.99 a month. First poll will go live when the first part of Man of Steel goes up. If you'd like to just make a one-time donation, you can always leave a super thanks in the comments below. In any case, I will see you all in our next adventure, whenever that may be.